right, it is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us this month for the April edition of our Science Communication webinar. For any of you I haven't met yet, I'm Sandy Bridges with the Wildlife Education Division. And to get us kicked off, let's go over a few housekeeping things. First, please make sure that you keep your cameras off and your mics muted. Any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat and we will go over them at the end and have some time for some discussion and questions at that point. And so with that, I want to introduce our speaker today. His name is Niels Peterson from NC State's Fishery and Wildlife Program. And he's here to talk to us about the research that he's done into the contributions of wildlife-focused climate change and resilience education on conservation efforts. So Niels, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to everybody today. I appreciate you having me here. For those of you who are expecting Catherine, I apologize. She definitely knows a lot more about wildlife education than I do, but I'm going to try to do justice to some of her research. And there should be time at the end of the talk for us to have a good discussion about it if you have some questions about anything that I covered a little bit too quickly. All right, so I believe this is going to be posted. There'll be a video of it. So I've shared this environmental education lab at NC State, and at the end of the lecture, there will be contact information if you have specific questions for Catherine related to some of her environmental education research. Today, I'm going to start by talking about the value of K through 12 education, particularly focused on wildlife. The first is just within the education domain, there's a well-established fact that early intervention matters, which means working in K through 12 context before the university where I'm at, right? Working in K through 12 context is also really valuable because that's where everybody goes, right? It's one location where all the people are at some point, and it's the most effective place to do education. And two of the areas that I'd like to focus on in today's presentation are that, one, working with children is particularly rewarding because they're less biased learners. Their ideologies aren't driving what information they're willing to sort of assimilate and think about and use to solve problems. And they can also inspire and influence their families and their broader communities. And so those sort of yellow text bits are what I'm going to dig into a little bit more here. So first, in terms of this less bias issue, there's some pretty long-term research showing that in some ways, numeracy or sort of familiarity with science and math and those skills, knowledge skills we need, can backfire in association with our ideology. And what you see in this sort of plot on, I think, the left side of the screen is this idea that communitarian adults, or people with this ideology focused on equality and community and togetherness, tend to be, when it comes to that relationship between their views on how big of an issue climate change is and their numeracy, there's not a strong relationship. And what you'd expect, right, is that that group, the more they know, the more concerned they are about it, the more they want to act on it. And conversely, among individualists, right, the sort of strong individual, protect my rights, I do what I want, don't worry about the community, you'd expect the same relationship where the better they are at science, the better they are at math, the more concerned they are about this scientific issue of climate change. And you actually find the opposite. As their numeracy goes up, they think it's less of an issue, right? And the sort of hypothesized mechanism here is people who are really good at science and math are also really good at sort of cherry picking what bits of that science and math support their personal ideologies. And we did a study going on 10 years ago now with kids, basically replicating that. And we found this wonderful relationship you see on the right side, where instead of creating polarization, knowledge and education brought those two types of value of kids with different value orientations in terms of being more communitarian or individualistic, brought them together. And it not only brought them together, it got both of them to see climate change as a bigger issue. So education worked instead of backfiring among kids. after that study, we also were sort of wanting to dig into this idea that kids might be effective at educating families or adults when, particularly in contexts where direct education efforts aren't as successful. And there's a lot of literature out there suggesting this sort of kid to parent relationship of education occurs, right? So this table shows marketing, right? All the ads for toys and video games and sugary cereals and everything else are based on the established idea that children can influence their parents, in this case, what their parents shell out money for, right? But there's also a lot of research showing that kids shape their parents' views on sexual orientation and a bunch of issues associated with it. And kids are the most effective drivers of any change among their parents' views on those issues. And there's some research on wildlife conservation showing the same thing. Kids are powerful in terms of influencing what their parents think. Some of the big cases of sort of private money going into wildlife conservation, like I think the group Panthera does big cat stuff, and a group that spent millions of dollars on indigo snake conservation. They're both cases of a kid telling their relatively well-off parents, you need to solve this problem, and the parent doing it, right? Recycling is another case where it was pushed through K through 12 schools from kids to parents and broadly adopted. And climate change was another area we thought this might be a sort of valuable pathway to influencing collective behavior and behavior among adults, where you might not be able to provide education effectively directly to adults. And so back many years ago, we actually developed climate change curricula in association with the Wildlife Resources Commission and Project Wild. And there's an interesting backstory there we might discuss in the sort of Q&A at the end, but in terms of how it ended up being something linked to the commission and to Project Wild. But the curricula is available at this link. It focuses on local issues. It was a full semester project. It was linked to the sort of outcomes teachers were required to teach within the curricula. And it encouraged parental participation. The kids would interview their parents, ask them about issues in terms of how long-term changes in where wetlands were and things like that impacted wildlife or might impact wildlife. And the basic results of this study sort of fit the hypotheses we brought into designing the study and were really interesting, right? So we randomly had a couple hundred kids in a control group where they just did what they would normally do in middle school. And we had the same size of group in this treatment where their teachers use this wildlife, weather, and climate curricula, and the kids engaged their parents. And what we found is kids within that curricula had more concern than the control kids, right? So there was a causal relationship between participating in this curricula and as a child being worried about climate change and thinking this is something we need to deal with, right? But the really interesting stuff actually came in terms of what happened with parental concern of the kids in the control versus the treatment, right? So there was a relationship, and that relationship had sort of several mediating factors, right? So first, the change in what kids thought about climate change was more powerful in sort of increasing parental concern about climate change among kids with conservative parents and for conservative parents. It was more powerful for dads than for moms. And it was more powerful when the kid in question who was communicating this information or interacting with parents was a daughter. And all of these things, well, the first two are really important because the sort of foot draggers in terms of dealing with climate change are the conservative parents and the dads relative to the more liberal parents and the moms. So this approach to dealing with this issue and educating by focusing on youth was the most effective at working with the groups that were the most sort of resilient to this type of information or resistant to this type of information. And then the latter relationship is interesting just because it sort of ties into some of the psychology research associated with environmental behavior, which shows that essentially girls are more effective sort of spokespersons for many issues than boys are, just because of our psychology, right? And it can deal with issues beyond environmental issues and beyond wildlife issues. So once we were able to sort of see, like, yes, kids can influence their parents and in really important and impactful ways, we sort of moved on to how kids can impact their communities more broadly beyond just their parents. And a lot of this work, Dr. Diamantia here, pictured on the bottom of the slide, and Catherine were sort of central to, and I had more of a peripheral role, but I'll do my best to kind of explain what happened. So in this case, the curricula was one put out by the Duke Marine Labs, and it was focused on marine debris and worked with 4th and 5th graders. And again, there was this control group and the treatment group. Treatment group got to participate in this curricula. And the curricula, instead of just being aimed at kids engaging with their parents as they learned content linked to science standards, the kids actually engaged with their communities, local political leaders, businesses, things like that. And what we found was really exciting. So this bar chart, probably with too small a text, I think shows two things, right? So the reddish color in this case is sort of public officials, people involved in local government, and the yellow is like local voters, just local people in the community, right? And from the pre to post test, after the sort of kids were involved in this marine debris curricula that involved presentations at like community meetings, at local restaurants, things like that, concern over marine debris went up, and support for ordinances, right, like plastic bag ordinances and things like that, increased as well. And that's good news, right? You had an impact. But my little emoji here was this sort of really large impact or bigger impact on officials relative to voters, which you see on the far right of the screen. For those of you that are familiar with just politics in general, local, national, whatever, those officials are often sort of the ones sort of following well behind the wave of public opinion, right? They want to be really careful about making policy decisions that are in advance of what their voters actually want. But in this case, those kids, their presentations, the message they had was actually more impactful on those local officials than it was even on the voters, even though it impacted both positively in terms of supporting policies to address marine debris. And at this point, I don't know that we have a good explanation for that, but it's wonderful news because those local officials are the ones that can actually carry it out, and they're also the ones that are often nervous about doing so, even though public support is there. In the same project, we saw that political polarization over just the levels of marine debris concern and also support for ordinances decreased in the post scores relative to the pre scores. So having kids operate as community spokespersons for this issue decreased the polarization, made this issue less of a political issue and more of just a shared community issue, which is just refreshing in the times we live in. So I'm going to shift gears here now to some stuff that I'm a little more familiar with and a little more recent. So we know that environmental education, particularly with wildlife subjects, can promote concern for nature, can build community support for conservation. It can have all these good benefits, but what's in it for the actual participants, the people, right, who are getting the education? And the sort of first thing, right, is just knowledge. If you're educating, there's just this belief that knowledge is good and it's being put in people's heads and that's valuable. But there's also this potential that that education or that experience associated with wildlife education promotes well-being in various ways for the participants. And that can be really valuable for many reasons. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit here. in the latter half of the presentation. And I'm going to focus or kind of drill down on the idea of mental health. So this World Health Organization definition of it is just the state of well-being in which you can cope, right? And you can contribute. So you're basically, you feel good and you're functional, right? And that's hard to achieve sometimes. And it's becoming a bigger issue in terms of people that aren't able to maintain mental health. There's a lot of research going on now that shows that mental health issues are sort of tied with cardiovascular and circulatory diseases for the biggest ones we face globally in terms of the total years human beings live with disabilities or disability adjusted life years. The latter is sort of a combination of years lived with a disability plus years lost due to dying early. So mental health is a sort of mushy concept that sometimes is hard to deal with, but has huge and growing impacts on just global human well-being and people's lives and productivity. And there is some emerging research that shows that exposure to nature helps with mental health. And a lot of this research, just before I go into the details of it, it talks about nature exposure of some sort or another, but that nature exposure isn't sort of any type of nature. Sadly, for the deserts of the world, it rarely sort of is operationalized in that way. It's almost always forests or tree cover, which could be a good thing in North Carolina, where we don't have a lot of prairie, right? But the research that's going on progressively shows that there's no real effect going from like an urban area to spending more time in a wide open savanna, which sort of might conflict with what people my age or older learned in like history and anthropology classes in school, where we were told we were pre-programmed for a savanna genetically and things like that. There's no real effect of that on well-being, but there are positive effects going from an urban environment to a forest or going from an average forest to a super forest, right? So those relationships are sort of repeatedly documented in peer-reviewed literature. So I'm going to review some of the direct pathways between spending time in nature and mental health. The first is there's a bunch of studies showing that it improves attention and cognitive function, and most of these are in K through 12 informal education context in terms of where the research is happening. But it's basically just saying people, but particularly kids, can do better in school when they spend a decent amount of time in nature, but particularly in forests. There's also been research showing that adults who, for various reasons, including like recent imprisonment, are sort of pushed aside or on the margins of society, that doing activities that require them to spend time in nature help them develop a sense of purpose and ability to manage life tasks, which are both key elements in that World Health Organization definition of mental health. And there's also some emerging research showing that this sort of time in nature and the benefits for mental health are the type of things that, instead of lifting all boats equally, they do help everyone, but they help the people who often fall behind more, which is really rare and really valuable, because the goal, right, with these interventions, well-being interventions or educational interventions, isn't just to sort of make this sort of very inequitable society we live in better for everybody. It's to make it better for everybody and help the people that are suffering the most, right? So this is just in reference to a study that looked at people with acronyms, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral disabilities, I believe. So found that students with those conditions benefited more than average students in terms of classroom attention, reduced disruptive behaviors, and their learning outcomes when they participated in outdoor classrooms. And this was a study related to a North Carolina sort of started program called Muddy Sneakers that is based out of the mountains, but operates in the Piedmont and I think in South Carolina now. There's also research showing that spending time in nature reduces anxiety, ADHD, depression, NDVI, like where you live, has been sort of correlated across the US with improved sleep. So having a forest around your house could actually, we don't know the mechanisms, but can actually help you sleep better, which for those of you with sleep challenges, you probably know that can have an impact on mental health. And there's a very large body of research showing that just proximity to forests, being close to forests, having them around where you live and spend your time, just makes people, in terms of evaluating their own happiness, evaluate it more highly than people who don't have this proximity to forests. And sometimes researchers will look at this sort of subjective well-being idea and be like, it's kind of mushy. That's how people say they feel, but they might really be sick, right? But I think it's really important to consider subjective well-being because it's sort of less paternalistic than some other measures of well-being. And whether people feel themselves that they're happy and that they have mental health, in many ways can be more important than some more objective measure of whether they do. There's also some emerging research showing that these sort of mental health benefits extend across a wide diversity of age groups, but may have bigger effects among kids, and that it makes people potentially more resilient to stressors. So this is a couple of studies we did linked to sort of subjective well-being over the COVID pandemic. And what we found is sort of what this presentation has been hinting at might happening, right? If you look at the left side of the screen, this is the adults and what happened to their sort of subjective well-being scores across the pandemic. And what we saw is among adults, generally people, their sort of happiness went down during the pandemic. And that's as expected. But we saw that people who maintained their time outside or increased it had very small decreases, much smaller than people who quit going outside. And we saw a similar pattern among sort of youth, younger than 18 people, but it was even more pronounced, right? So if they had less time in nature, their sort of decline in subjective well-being, mental health, was pretty severe. And if they were able to maintain time outside or even increase it, that drop just completely disappeared. So there was this powerful effect of spending time in nature that was able to sort of insulate people, but particularly youth, from those damaging effects or that particular stressor that was very difficult for all of us to handle. And I wanted to wrap this up with a study that we haven't sort of pressed all the lapels on, but we actually did last year in the College of Natural Resources right across the street from y'all, using a greenway next to the office I'm sitting in. And in this study, we solicited a bunch of volunteers in our college, primarily students, randomly assigned them to a control group, a nature walk, or a bird watching group. And they only had to go out once a week. The control group just did what they would have done. The nature walk group walked on the greenway, minimum of 30 minutes, minimum once a week, and just enjoyed nature. The bird watching group did the same thing, but they counted different bird species. They were given the Merlin app and explained how to use it. And we looked at a measure of their sort of subjective well-being, psychological well-being questions, several questions like how happy are you? Do you wake up refreshed in the morning? Is life good? That type of thing. And also a measure of psychological distress of like, how stressed are you? Life is like overwhelming, that kind of stuff. And we did a pre at the beginning of the semester and a post at the end of the semester test for the people in these groups, right? And what we saw, unfortunately, due to small sample sizes, the nature walk wasn't significant, but it's what you'd expect, right? So their well-being went up over the semester and did so more than the control. And bird watching, even with small sample sizes, had a significant jump in well-being pre versus post, and also relative to the control group. So bird watching caused increased psychological well-being. And on the flip side, bird watching caused a decrease in psychological distress. And again, if you look at the pattern for all three groups, distress went up for the control group, which makes sense as we're sort of coming in towards the end of the semester. All these stressors on students and faculty like me go up, right? All the deadlines are coming. But the nature walk people and bird watching people flipped that story on its head, and their distress went down. They were able to sort of account for that increased stress and still have it go down. And you saw a similar thing maybe for psychological well-being. It went up over the semester for all the groups. Maybe just like, hey, we're almost to the end. It's going to be awesome. I'm happy about that. But it went up most for those who were doing bird watching, and more so than for the control. So it was an exciting finding. And then I'm just going to cover some of the indirect pathways between time and nature and mental health at the end here. And these are ones that I haven't done as much research in myself. First, spending time in nature can indirectly improve physical health in addition to mental health. And the idea here is just that mental health and physical health are fundamentally connected. If your mental health goes up, you're more likely to be engaged in active lifestyles. And if you have access to exercise or to natural areas, you're more likely to have to participate in an active lifestyle. So there's this feedback between physical and mental health and access to nature and spending time in nature. There's also this sort of value that's created by increased social cohesion. So spending time in nature and having these sort of shared natural spaces has been linked both to higher social capital, or that's just fancy jargon for the value of social relationships that can be used to get things done, and also to lower violent crime. There's some pretty well-known studies of comparing like housing projects where there were violent crime with and without green space, and it was lower in the ones with green space where people spent time. There are also financial benefits for sort of having nature available and used around people's houses. There's research showing that sort of communities where there's a lot of this green space have lower healthcare costs on average. There's research showing that a lot of trees around houses can lower energy bills, and the asterisk is reflective of where this happens, right? Trees are a lot more valuable in place around houses in communities where there aren't that many trees, and they're less valuable in communities where there are, because you can get the benefits of the trees without them being right next to your house. Having green space and trees increases property values, and the study cited there is actually one we did for the commission, and this was focused on wildlife management areas, but it showed in certain contexts how wildlife management areas can increase property values in their proximity. And people who live in areas with more green space actually report sort of, again, this is that self-assessed, but they report higher financial well-being than people in areas with less sort of tree cover and green space available. And a lot of what I've presented today is sort of indicative of a need for future research versus being the final word, right? So there's not enough information about dosage, right? How much of this time in nature or time bird watching or time interacting out in the woods actually creates the effects we want. There's also not a lot of research on how context shape the relationship, right? Like if you own property that's wildlife habitat, or that is a working forest, or you're actually a logger, right? Does spending time in the woods have the same benefits for you as if you're someone from an urban community and that's where you spend most of your time? And then there's also this need for experiments, right? Controls and treatments, because most of the research is using big existing data sets to establish correlations. And there's this sort of probably highly likely scenario where happy people go out into the forest or seek out opportunities to spend time in nature versus the other way around. And there's also a need for valuation, right? So some people have talked about the possibility of psychological ecosystem services, but basically what's the value being provided by time in nature, by access to a forest, by access to a wildlife management area, right? And answering that question is tricky. It goes a lot. It goes way further than an economic impact analysis and something you sort of pump into canned software like InPlan, right? Especially when you're thinking about health impacts, mental health impacts, right? Those values are way higher than the ones we currently understand, and we really don't understand them yet. So this will be recorded as contact information for myself and for Catherine, the guru of the environmental education components of my presentation. And let me can probably go, I think I can go back to screen sharing here, but I'm gonna try to shrink this stuff so that I can talk to people. All right, can I field some questions? Or I probably can just look in the chat.
Yeah, your first question was about what mushrooms were on one of your slides.
Yes, that is maitake. So that was one of my family's late pandemic activities we discovered that was so fun and so beneficial.
All right. So one question I had just in listening to it, I know at the beginning you mentioned some connection between Project Wild and some of the work that was done. Is that anything you can elaborate on?
Yeah, so I promised a potential backstory if people were interested. So back when this study was done, as I mentioned, one of the challenges that potentially can be addressed by engaging kids in our environmental education efforts is that it is this sort of these ideological biases we as adults bring to the way we interpret information, right? And climate change and its impacts on everything, including wildlife conservation, is sort of fraught with ideological biases, right? And when we actually put this study together, it was going to be with Project WET, which probably still is, but at the time was through the state EPA. And due to sort of political issues at the time, after we received Sea Grant funding to do the study, our partners were told that they couldn't talk about, email about, or do anything about climate change. And we were like, well, we were already funded. What are we going to do? And we had this long-standing relationship with the WRC and chatted with our colleagues here. And they were nice enough to sort of risk working on it with us. And what we did is what we were going to do with Project WET, but with Project Wild. So we contacted the state and national leaders and worked together to design a curricula that followed all Project Wild's rules, which, you know, they're engaged and they're tied to learning standards that we know the teachers have to teach to. So we sort of followed all their rules, developed the curricula, posted it, and then did this controlled treatment experiment to see both how that worked in terms of promoting concern about climate and change behaviors related to climate, support for conservation issues among the participants relative to the control, but also among the parents of the participants relative to the control.
Awesome. And we do have a question in the chat. Cece says, happy people go to the woods versus the other way around. How do you parse that with research?
Yeah, so the way you do it is the way we tried to last year here at NC State. And we've got a manuscript on that. We kind of showed that bird watching was better than a control and that it was a causal thing where you put people out bird watching and they get happier, right? But that requires a control and a treatment, and randomly putting people in the control group versus the treatment group. It's not as clean as control treatment experiments in a medical context where you've got like the placebo pill and the real pill, right? Because there's still this element of people knowing I'm just doing what I'm doing, and other people knowing, oh, I'm in the bird watching group, I'm supposed to be a little bit happier, right? But you do get at the issue of directionality and causality with it. Whereas most of the research, it's just really time consuming and expensive and hard to fund these experiments on subjects like this versus experiments on a pill, right? And so most of the research is correlational. And when that happens, you don't know the direction. You can, based on your gut or logic, sort out the direction, but a lot of the research in this domain is like a national or global mental health or health indice survey that runs every year, every 5 years, and people sort of grab that data and link it with NDVI metrics of greenness or percent land cover of a certain type of land cover and stuff like that. And then we're getting some really good insights from that, but we can't look at directionality unless we do an experiment.
That makes sense. And Steve asks, why are they happy? Any insight into what causes that happiness or that change?
Yeah, so we speculated on it for our bird watching thing, right? And for that, our explanation that is not tested, it would require more research, right? Is the purposefulness of it, right? So if you're out in the woods and you're just like, I'm walking from point A to point B, there's sort of a lot of sort of gray area in terms of how purposeful you are, how much you're focused on the sounds you hear, the things you're seeing, nature itself, right? Whereas if people are bird watching and they're like, I'm paying so much attention that I can parse out some sound to know it's a particular kind of bird, and then I'm looking for that bird and trying to see it, right? That makes people more purposeful and more engaged with nature than they would be otherwise. So that might be an explanation, right? In terms of they're more purposeful and more engaged. And they're in terms of sort of literature that talks about sort of the mechanisms involved, right? There's some element that I alluded to with the stuff that older people got in their history books about how we're like hardwired genetically to like a savanna scene because that's where humans evolved, right? So there's this idea that there might be an evolutionary mechanism that, right, like biophilia, the idea that, you know, we evolved as a species in natural environments, and when we're put in these like really artificial environments, things go haywire. Um, and there also I think there's a large body of peer-reviewed research coming out of Japan on this concept of forest bathing, which is linked to time and nature, but they actually have like rules for you can't just go hang out by a tree, right? There are like rules of what you have to do to really forest bathe. They've done a lot of research on it, some experimental stuff, and there, you know, it goes beyond just sort of this sort of maybe it's genetic or evolutionary to thinking about the sounds we're exposed to, um, the fact that we're sort of focusing on maybe therapeutic elements of the forest as opposed to stressors that are often controlling our focus and things like that, right? And there are also, I mean, I think some of the new concerns that have become really popular in terms of like kids and adults spending so much time on social media and the psychologically sort of damaging effects it can have, right? Most of these rules for time in nature are like putting all those damaging things away and focusing on the more therapeutic elements of a forest or of wildlife watching or something like that.
Okay. Fallon made a comment wondering if there's an element of mindfulness to it, which is kind of what you were just alluding to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that might even be one of the rules of like official forest bathing. I haven't looked at the literature recently enough to remember it, but that sounds like one, right? And I think that also fits with the bird watching thing, is you're almost forcing mindfulness in a situation where it might not be there for some participants in like a nature walk.
Sarah had a question about people's fears of the outdoors, especially in forests. In any of your research, were you kind of addressing some of the fears in order to help people overcome it to get outside, or have you seen anything about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I know there's sort of this, whenever there's research done on this topic or even related ones, like just doing recreation, let alone whether it has positive mental, like mental health effects or physical health effects, right? There's always this situation where certain groups, lower SES groups, because of availability, certain cultural and ethnic groups, because of cultural things, historical things, right? They don't participate as much and they don't benefit as much, right? The mechanisms I still don't think are really clearly understood. Our dean here, Myron Floyd, has I think he wrote a paper like 20 years ago saying there's these drivers that have to do with access, the SES element, and these cultural drivers, and we need to sort them out. I don't know that we've made a lot of progress since Myron's paper on that. But I do think it's a really important sort of domain for future research. And part of the reason I think is that this emerging research, some of which I talked about, suggests that the benefits, like for African American or Latinx groups, are bigger than for other groups. And a good rationale for that, I think a good explanation, it's not totally hashed out, but it makes a lot of sense, is just that these are groups where the baseline's lower, right? And if you think about like testing, if you want to do an intervention to make test grades go up, you're going to be the most effective among people with the lower test grades. So just because there's more room, right? And so if you want to do an intervention where you help people's mental health by helping them enjoy nature, the people who have no exposure at all, whoever those people are, right, are the ones who are going to give you the most sort of benefit for sort of unit effort invested in getting those people out in the woods and enjoying the woods, right? But I think, that domain is an area where we just need more work, more knowledge, more research, for sure.
Okay. Sydney put a question in about the muddy sneakers data that you had put up there. How much time was needed to see the benefits that you mentioned of being outdoors? And then did these benefits translate back into the classroom for a long period of time, or does it require continued exposure to the outdoors for that to kind of continue?
Oh, this is where my memory is failing me. Sydney, if you email me, I might be able to help with that question in terms of pinning it down a little bit better than what will be my vague response here. So this program required a much bigger intervention than some of the other ones we looked at. Like, I think it was 10 full days out in the woods for the kids, and they were like real days. Like, they'd bus them to the woods. They'd get out and they would not get back in the bus till the end of the school day. Included bathroom breaks and eating. Nothing happened if it wasn't in the woods, right? So it was very intense. It had effects all the way through the semester, which was great. That study, we didn't look at sort of long-term effects, but we did do a follow-up study with high school kids who had done this in elementary school. And we looked at sort of, did you participate in Muddy Sneakers in elementary school? Did you participate in Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a couple other programs that were common in the sort of Brevard region where the sort of hub of this was happening? And I can't get into too many of the specifics here because I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know one thing that showed up was that people in a couple of those groups, but definitely Muddy Sneakers, had a stronger sort of connection to place for local protected areas, whatever, 8-9 years later. So that persisted even if other stuff didn't, in terms of just having a connection to their local forests, state parks, wildlife management areas, and having them be a part of their lives definitely persisted from that one sort of year or semester intervention with participating.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions that you want to drop in the chat before we end for today? All right, seeing none. Nils, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate everything that you presented and for stepping in for Catherine when she needed you to. So thank you so much. And then for everybody else, thank you for coming. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel in the next couple of months. And please make sure you join us next month for Luis Suau with our conservation policy and analysis to talk about his work in the realm of accessibility. So we look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.
Sandra, do you need anything else on my end?
I don't think so. Heather, do you need anything from him?
No, we are good. Thank you so much for pinch hitting for us, Nils.
Yeah, it was great to see y'all. Have a good one.
Good to see you guys. All right, bye.
Bye.